Welcome back to our deep dive into Karl Marx's Das Kapital. If you've been following along, you already know that capitalism is a system built on contradictions. Commodities hide the exploitation of labor. Profit isn't just made, it's extracted. And wealth isn't created through hard work alone, but through a system that ensures the rich stay rich while workers struggle to make ends meet. In this episode, we're breaking down chapters 19 through 22 of Das Kapital, where Marx exposes wages as the biggest illusion of capitalism. A trick that makes workers believe they're being paid fairly, when in reality, they're getting just enough to keep coming back the next day. From factory floors to the gig economy, nothing has really changed. Today we'll uncover how wages obscure the real exploitation of labor, the difference between time wages and piece wages, how the gig economy is just a modern twist on an old capitalist trick, and why wages are different across countries, and what that means for workers everywhere. If wages are supposed to be fair, then why do so many workers still struggle? Why do some earn more than others for the same work? And why, no matter how hard we work, do the rich always seem to get richer? Stick around, because by the end of this episode, you'll never look at a paycheck the same way again. At first glance, wages seem simple. You work, you get paid. But Marx shows us that wages are one of capitalism's biggest illusions, a tool that makes workers believe they are being paid fairly, when in reality, they are only being paid just enough to survive and return to work the next day. In chapter 19, Marx explains a crucial distinction. Capitalists don't pay for labor itself, they pay for labor power, your ability to work for a set period. This difference is key because it hides the real transaction taking place. For example, let's say a factory worker produces goods worth $100 in an 8-hour shift, but their wage, $20. That extra $80, the unpaid labor, becomes surplus value, which capitalists pocket as profit. Now chapter 20 introduces time wages, when workers are paid by the hour, day, or week. This system makes it seem like an equal exchange, but in reality, workers produce far more value than they receive in wages. Let's say a worker starts out making 5 products an hour. Over time, with better tools and faster techniques, they produce 8 products an hour, but their wage remains unchanged. Their increased productivity generates more profit for the capitalist, but no additional pay for them. And when workers push for higher wages, capitalists use familiar tactics to maintain their profits, extending the working day, cutting break times, increasing workloads. This is why the fight for the 8-hour workday was so important, because capitalists will always try to squeeze as much unpaid labor out of workers as possible. But what happens when wages aren't tied to hours at all? What if workers are paid only for what they produce, taking on all the risks themselves? Let's move into chapter 21 of Das Kapital, where Marx examines piece wages, a wage system that transfers all the risk onto workers while maximizing profits for capitalists. At first, piece wages sound like a good deal. Instead of being paid by the hour, workers are paid for each individual item they produce. The idea is simple. The harder you work, the more you earn. But here's the problem. Capitalists manipulate this system to extract more and more labor without increasing wages. But in reality, this system forces workers to compete against each other, work longer hours, and push themselves past exhaustion, all while capitalists lower pay rates over time. Under piece wages, workers aren't paid for their time. They're paid for how much they produce. The more items completed, the more they earn. Sounds fair, right? But here's the problem. Capitalists manipulate this system to extract more and more labor without increasing wages. For example, let's say a factory worker is paid 50 cents per shirt. To make a decent wage, they push themselves to produce more shirts per hour. But once productivity rises across the workforce, capitalists cut the per-piece rate. So now, instead of 50 cents, workers are only paid 40 cents per shirt. They have to work even harder just to maintain the same income. And if they can't keep up, they fall behind. The slowest workers earn next to nothing. The entire system turns workers into competitors, constantly pushing themselves to avoid falling into poverty. Now, you might be thinking, this sounds familiar. That's because the modern gig economy is just piece wages in disguise. Instead of factory workers paid per piece, we now have drivers and freelancers working for companies who pay their workers, or independent contractors, per task. Today, 36% of US workers, roughly 57 million people, are part of the gig economy. They don't receive a salary, they don't get hourly wages, they are only paid when they complete a gig. At first, gig work seems like freedom. You can work whenever you want. But just like piece wages in Marx's time, this system forces workers to compete for jobs, work longer hours, and absorb all the risks themselves. No guaranteed income, no sick leave, no labor protections. A recent study found that 14% of gig workers earn less than the federal minimum wage on an hourly basis. When you factor in gas, vehicle maintenance, and unpaid time between gigs, the reality becomes clear. Gig workers, just like piece wage workers of the past, are squeezed for profit. And just like factory owners in the past, modern gig platforms control workers' wages without them realizing it. Ever notice how a certain rideshare company changed their pay structures over time? But as more drivers enter the platform, the company slowly lowers the rates. And the best part for capitalists? Unlike traditional factories, where owners have to buy equipment and pay for maintenance, in the gig economy, workers have to provide everything themselves: their cars, their gas, their insurance. Capitalists get all the profits, while workers take all the risks. So what does Marx's Chapter 21 teach us? Whether it's piece wages in the 19th century or gig work in the 21st century, the system is the same. Workers are forced to compete. Wages are driven down, and capitalists extract as much labor as possible while taking none of the risks. And just like piece wage workers in Marx's time, today's gig workers aren't guaranteed stability. Their pay is set by algorithms, not by fair negotiation. They are at the mercy of a system designed to keep them working harder for less. In Chapter 22 of Das Kapital, Marx turns his focus to a major question. Why do wages differ across countries? Is it because workers in some nations are more productive? Is it because of economic fairness? Or is there something else at play? Marx shows us that wage differences are not about fairness at all. They are part of a larger system where capitalists move production to wherever labor is cheapest, using global inequality to drive wages down and keep workers divided. At first, it seems obvious that wages differ based on cost of living. A worker in the US needs a higher wage to survive than a worker in Vietnam or Ethiopia. But Marx explains that wage differences are not just about living costs. They are a deliberate strategy used by capitalists to maximize profits and weaken labor movements. Over the past century, we've seen a clear pattern. Mid-20th century, manufacturing dominated in the US and Western Europe. 1980s, 2000s, production shifted to China as wages in the West became too high. 2010s, present. As wages in China rose, companies moved to Vietnam, Bangladesh, and India. Today, factories are shifting again, this time toward Africa, where labor is even cheaper. This global wage system isn't just about saving money, it's a weapon against workers. When workers in one country demand higher wages, capitalists threaten to relocate jobs to lower wage countries. This puts pressure on workers everywhere to accept lower pay and worse conditions. Since the year 2000, the US alone has lost over 5 million manufacturing jobs as corporations offshored production to cheaper labor markets. But did those savings benefit workers anywhere? No. The profits went to corporate executives and shareholders. And while wages remain low for workers worldwide, corporate executives are making more money than ever. Since 1978, CEO pay has increased by a staggering 1,209%, while worker wages have grown only 15%. The exploitation is global, but so are the profits. The key takeaway from Chapter 22 is that wage differences are used to divide workers and weaken their power. Instead of uniting for higher wages, workers in different countries are pitted against each other in a race to the bottom. American workers are told their jobs are going to Mexico. Mexican workers are told their jobs are going to Bangladesh. Bangladeshi workers are told their jobs are going to Uganda, so on and so forth. This strategy keeps workers fighting among themselves, instead of fighting against the system that exploits them all. If workers in one country demand better wages, capitalists move production elsewhere and tell them, if you don't like it, we'll find someone else who will work for less. This is why international worker solidarity is so important. The only way to fight back is for working and oppressed people to unite across borders, against the elites who hold all of the cards. So now that we understand wages, what's next? If capitalism is built on wage exploitation, then the next question is, how does capital grow? Where does all this surplus value go? And most importantly, what happens when capitalism runs out of room to expand? In the next chapters of Das Kapital, Marx takes us deeper into the mechanics of capital accumulation and the contradictions of capitalist expansion. Because capitalism must keep expanding to survive. But what happens when expansion is no longer possible? What happens when the system reaches its breaking point? Join us next time to find out. If you found this breakdown helpful, hit the like button. It helps more people find this video. And if you want to keep learning about Marxist theory and the realities of capitalism, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode.